What if the key to unlocking your forgotten past wasn't a person, a document, or a photograph, but a lost puppy with a secret hidden in plain sight? This isn't just a story about a stray dog who needed a home. It's a story about how the deepest loyalties can echo through time, and how one veterinarian's simple act of kindness was about to unravel a lie that an entire town had been telling itself for 17 years. The rain over Cedar Hollow, Oregon, wasn't the gentle kind. It was a relentless percussive drumming that hammered against the windows of the Cedar Hollow Animal Hospital, trying to wash away the sins of the sleepy forest-hemmed town. Inside, under the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, Dr. Aris Thorne felt every single one of his 16 hours on shift pressing down on his shoulders. His coat, once a crisp white, was now a canvas of iodine streaks and muddy paw prints. Just another casualty of a careless world. Aris's hands moved with the gentle practice of a decade spent mending the broken and comforting the scared. He began cleaning the mud-caked fur, murmuring softly to the trembling pup. As his fingers worked around the puppy's neck, they brushed against something hard and worn beneath the fur. He parted the wet strands and found it a leather collar. He almost dismissed it. But something was wrong. The collar was old, cracked, and far too big for a puppy this young. It was an artifact from another time before microchips and GPS tags. Curiosity, the last ember of energy he had left, flickered to life. He unbuckled it. On the inside, faded but still legible, was an address etched into the leather. 1412 Sparrow Creek Lane. The air in the room went cold. The rain, the thunder, the hum of the lights, it all faded into a deafening silence in his mind. Aris froze his breath, catching in his throat. That address wasn't just an address. It was a ghost. A landmark of tragedy in Cedar Hollow. 17 years ago, 1412 Sparrow Creek Lane was the home of the Anderson family. The father, a brilliant investigative journalist. The mother, a beloved local artist. Their 10-year-old son. All of them gone in a single night. An inferno that the official report called a tragic accident. A story sewn up and buried with suspicious speed. But the town whispered a different story. They whispered about the powerful local tycoon the father was about to expose. They whispered about arson. And most of all, they whispered about the 5-year-old daughter, Lily. Her body was never found. She had simply vanished from the face of the earth, becoming a piece of local folklore. The girl who was either consumed by the flames or stolen away into the night. Aris stared at the collar in his hand. This had to be a coincidence. A cruel, meaningless prank of fate. Some kid probably found it in the woods and put it on a stray. He was a vet, not a detective. His job was to treat infections and set broken bones, not to chase 17-year-old ghosts. He should put the collar in a drawer, give the puppy his shots, and find him a home. That was the logical thing to do. The safe thing. It's a profound thing, a physical object from the past. In a world of fleeting digital footprints, sometimes it's a worn piece of leather, a faded scrawl of ink that holds the heaviest truths. It's a quiet reminder that history leaves tangible echoes all around us, daring us to listen. He looked down at the puppy. The little dog had stopped shivering. He was sitting on the table, watching Aris with an unnerving, patient intelligence. It wasn't the vacant look of a normal stray. It was a gaze that seemed to hold a question, a plea, a purpose. In that moment, Aris Thorne made a choice that would change everything. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was no coincidence. This puppy hadn't just wandered into his clinic. It had been sent. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the number for his first morning appointment. He was no longer just a tired vet at the end of a long day. He was now the keeper of a secret, the first link in a chain that had been broken for nearly 2 decades. He looked down at the puppy, who simply stared back as if waiting for him to finally catch up. And Aris, a man who thought he was just saving a dog from the rain, whispered into the quiet of the clinic. "Who sent you?" 3 days of quiet waiting followed. 3 days of the puppy, who he now called Buddy, refusing to play with the other animals, choosing instead to sit by the clinic door waiting. Not for just anyone. He was waiting for someone specific. And Aris was beginning to fear that she was about to walk through that door at any moment. For 3 days, the puppy waited. He was a perfect patient, quiet and observant, but a strange melancholy clung to him. He ignored the squeaky toys and the friendly overtures from other animals, choosing instead to sit by the clinic's front door, his gaze fixed on the road outside. He wasn't just waiting. He was keeping a vigil. Aris Thorne found himself watching the door too, a knot of anticipation tightening in his stomach. And then on a crisp autumn afternoon, she walked in. She didn't look like someone who would own a puppy. She looked like someone who built things out of steel and fire. She wore worn-in steel-toed boots, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. There was a guarded tension in her shoulders, a self-reliance etched into the hard line of her jaw. Her hands resting on the counter were strong and calloused. She was a fortress. "I heard you might have found a stray lab," she said, her voice soft but direct, scanning the room as if assessing it for threats. Before Aris could even respond, a sound erupted from the kennel area. It wasn't a bark. It was a mournful howl, a sound of deep, soulful longing that built into a whine of pure, unadulterated recognition. The girl froze, every ounce of her tough exterior vaporizing in an instant. Her hand shot to her chest, her knuckles white. I've heard that sound before," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. "In my dreams." Aris knew in his gut this was her. He led her towards the kennels without a word. The moment they rounded the corner, Buddy launched himself at the metal gate, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. The girl dropped to her knees, the sound she made a choked sob. She slowly reached her fingers through the bars, and Buddy didn't lick them or nip at them. He pressed his head into her touch, nuzzling her palm, and letting out a soft, breathy whimper, like a long-lost secret finally being told. Back in Aris's office, the fortress was beginning to crumble. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I've never owned a dog. Not since I was a little girl." "How little?" Aris asked gently, his heart aching for her. She looked away, staring at the rain-streaked window. "I don't know. I don't have any memories before I was 7. She explained her story in clipped, detached sentences. Being found alone by the side of a highway. The foster care system. The name they gave her at the hospital because she couldn't tell them her own Jane Doe. She'd made a life for herself, a tough, solitary life as a welder, but it was a life built on a foundation of fog. She then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn shoebox. "This is it," she said. "This is everything I have from before." Inside were the fragments of a shattered life. A small silver locket tarnished with age that was sealed shut. A single plastic toy soldier, the kind boys used to collect. And a child's drawing on faded paper singed along one edge. It showed a crudely drawn family. A mom, a dad, a boy, and a little girl, standing next to a giant oak tree. It's a defense mechanism of the human mind, so profound it borders on magic. When a memory is too horrific, too soul-shattering to process, the mind will sometimes build a fortress around it. It doesn't erase the past. It just locks it in a room and throws away the key, all in the name of survival. Jane Doe wasn't broken. She was a survivor living in a prison she didn't even know she was in. Aris made a decision. He pulled out an old laminated newspaper clipping from his desk drawer and slid it across to her. It was a photo of the Anderson family taken a month before the fire. She picked it up, her fingers shaking. "I've never seen these people before," she insisted, but her voice cracked. Her eyes were locked on the little 5-year-old girl in the photo. A girl with ribbons in her hair and a mischievous smile. A girl who looked exactly like a younger version of herself. "He was wearing a collar when he was found," Aris said softly, pushing the worn leather strap across the desk. It had an address on it. 1412 Sparrow Creek Lane. The blood drained from her face. That can't be." The air in the room was thick with 17 years of unanswered questions. Aris saw the storm of denial and confusion in her eyes and knew he needed to break through. He leaned forward. "Let's forget all of this for a second. The collar, the photo. None of it. Just look at him. He gestured to the puppy, who was now lying at her feet, his head resting on her boot. When you look at him, what name comes to your mind? The very first one. Don't think about it. She looked down at the dog, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her lips parted, and a single word escaped, not as a thought, but as a breath, an echo from a life she couldn't remember. Buddy. Aris felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before he delivered the final impossible truth. Jane, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That was his name, the original Anderson family dog, the one that supposedly died in the fire. A detail that was never ever released to the public. It was the key, the one impossible coincidence that unlocked the door to the fortress. Jane stared at him, her eyes filling with tears as the fog of her past began to swirl. The dreams, the feeling of being lost, the sound of the dog's howl, it was all starting to connect. She wasn't just a lost woman. She was a missing piece. What do we do? She whispered the question, hanging in the air like a prayer. There's one person who might have the answers, Aris said, his voice firm with new purpose. The man who reported you missing 17 years ago. Your father's brother, Marcus Anderson. He still lives just an hour from here. And so the girl with no past got into a stranger's car with a dog who seemed to know all her secrets. She was driving toward a name she didn't recognize, toward a man she couldn't remember, but whose heart for 17 long years had never stopped searching for her. The 1-hour drive to meet Marcus Anderson was a journey through a landscape of misty Oregon pines that mirrored the fog in Jane's own mind. With every mile that passed, the name Lily felt less like a fantasy and more like a phantom limb, an ache for something she couldn't remember losing. Buddy sat in the back, his head resting on her shoulder, a warm, grounding presence in a world that was rapidly coming undone. Marcus Anderson lived in a modest craftsman house at the end of a quiet street, a house that seemed to be holding its breath. The man who opened the door looked like a faded photograph of the smiling father in the newspaper clipping. Grief had hollowed out his features, but a flicker of his brother's determined fire still burned in his eyes. He looked at Aris, then at the dog, and finally his gaze settled on Jane. He didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes tracing the lines of her face, searching for the ghost of the niece he had lost 17 years ago. Her eyes, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. She has her mother's eyes. Inside, surrounded by framed photos of a family frozen in time, the story came tumbling out. Marcus confirmed everything. His brother, Daniel Anderson, wasn't just a journalist. He was a warrior armed with a pen. He was days away from publishing a meticulously documented exposé on the criminal empire of Vincent Gallo, a ruthless real estate mogul who had built his fortune on bribery, extortion, and violence. The police report was a lie, a fabrication bought and paid for. Marcus said, his hands clenched into fists. They didn't just start a fire. They executed my family to bury a story. And they made sure the one cop who couldn't be bought was kicked off the case. That was their next call. Detective Miller, now retired, arrived an hour later. He was a grizzled, skeptical man with a deep-seated distrust for stories that sounded too good to be true. He listened patiently, his face an unreadable mask, as Aris explained the caller and Jane recounted her fractured past. But Miller had seen too much to believe in miracles. Then Jane brought out the shoebox. Miller picked up the singed drawing, his professional gaze missing nothing. He examined the locket, but it was the dog that finally broke through his hardened skepticism. He watched as Buddy, who had been lying protectively at Jane's feet, looked up at him with a calm, steady intelligence that was anything but typical. A cop who had spent a decade on the force knows dogs, and this one was different. This one was watching, listening, protecting. This wasn't a stray who got lucky. This was a guardian. Suddenly, Aris's phone buzzed. It was a frantic call from his neighbor who lived next to the clinic. Aris, there's a man here, she whispered. In a dark sedan. He was just trying your clinic door, looking in the windows. He's parked across the street now. Just watching. A chill swept through the room. It wasn't a random coincidence. It was a message. Because miles away, in a sterile glass-walled office overlooking the city, Vincent Gallo Jr. stared at a tablet. He was nothing like his brutish father. He was polished cold and surgically precise in his cruelty. On the screen was a screenshot of a months-old social media post from the Cedar Hollow Animal Shelter's page, a picture of a muddy Labrador puppy. Found near Sparrow Creek. Anyone recognize this little guy his associate had just unearthed? Gallo Jr. zoomed in his eyes, fixing on the distinctive handmade leather collar around the puppy's neck. A ghost from the past had just appeared on his screen. His dying father's final order echoed in his mind. Bury all the ghosts. Back at Marcus's house, the feeling of discovery had been replaced by the cold grip of fear. They weren't just digging up the past anymore. The past was now digging for them. The game had changed. They were no longer just searching for the truth. They were in a race against those who would kill to keep it buried. Under the weight of the sudden pressure, Jane's gaze fell upon the one thing she had left from her childhood, the singed drawing of her family by the giant oak tree. She traced the childish outline of the little girl of herself. Marcus saw it over her shoulder, and something in his memory clicked. His eyes widened, a sudden jolt of adrenaline cutting through his grief. The time capsule! He breathed the words tumbling out. My God, Daniel told me he buried a time capsule for you and Michael under that tree. He said it was for your future, something to open when you were older. I thought it was just a game. They all looked at each other, the same stunning realization dawning on their faces. It was never a game. The investigative journalist, knowing he was a target, had created the ultimate failsafe. He hadn't hidden his evidence in a safe or a bank vault. He had buried his life's work, the truth that had cost him his family, in a simple metal box, protected by nothing more than dirt roots and a father's love. They had a map, a memory, and a desperate hope buried under the roots of an old oak tree. But they were no longer the hunters.